In the severe German winters or the punishing heat of Mesopotamia, this daily diet became not merely a routine, but a test of system of supply logic and of human endurance. Legionaries cooked in contubernia groups of 8 clustered atop trench-heated pits or simple clay-fired hearths. Potage was stirred with spear hafts worn smooth by fire. But even here food enforced hierarchy. Centurions might supplement with goats or poultry requisitioned from local farms, while immunes attached to the legions, engineers Medici guards, often found themselves with slightly better portions doled out in recognition of their specialist standing. These were categories of identity more enduring than shields or paybooks. Who ate what and when defined who belonged, who could be trusted when rations ran thin. Yet the system could be undone by silence from Rome's ports or miscalculation by its prefect Antony. A missed sailing from Sicily, a spoiled batch in Alexandria, and even the patience of the veteran Frey. When Vindobona ran dry in early spring during Claudius's campaigns, the Cincius legate wrote that morale sank in direct proportion to the vinegar's clarity. Clean posca could restore order. Murky posca redoubled complaints. On more than one occasion, behind the palisade shadows of frontier forts, disobedience germinated not from war weariness but from spoiled rations. The hand may have held a gladius, but the belly ruled the sword. And when it failed, men deserted, or mutinied, quietly trading discipline for desperation. Food was the army's pulse and evidence of Rome's reach. A soldier drinking sharp vinegar from a cracked cup carried within him not only thirst, but the unspoken question: how long could the empire feed its defenders? Even as new roads cut through Gaul and outposts rose above the Rhine, that question grew more urgent. Supplies from Cisalpine fields might arrive spoiled or not at all. Baked bread blackened with aged salt, reduced to clumps, wine vinegar soured past use. On such days it was not the enemy beyond the limes that worried the centurions, but the silence among their men. A silence hunger could twist into revolt. Feeding the winter watch at the edge of empire, where the Rhine froze over and the sun shrank to a dim coin in leaden skies, the routine of the Roman soldier turned fragile. In outposts scattered across northern Britannia and the dense forests of Germania, winter separated seasoned commanders from mere bureaucrats with swords. When the annona failed to arrive and the cursus publicus fumbled the season's logistics, the belly judged the governor more harshly than the emperor ever could. Snow buried paved roads, mud claimed supply carts axle deep. Oxen collapsed under the cold before they reached the way stations, and where amphorae of wine and sacks of grain once flowed smoothly from provincial depots, now came only silence. Winter revealed what no vexillum dared admit, that the empire's edge was stitched together not by laws or legions, but by weather, trust, and timely food. Each winter watch across the limes posed new arithmetic for survival. Rome's economy had no excess. The military diet, calculated in modi of wheat, measures of salt, buckets of vinegar, was plotted with all the rigidity of a legion's marching pace. But snow did not respect ledgers. In Germania Inferior, when wooden granaries soaked through and storage pits turned sour with mold, centurions appealed to local tribes for fodder, fuel, and flour. A logic of emergency began. Requisition without coin, demands without diplomacy. Roman officers claimed it was necessity, the locals called it theft. In Britannia things grew colder still. The turf ramparts of the Antonine Wall hid garrisons so remote that Rome felt not like a fatherland but a rumor. Watchmen on the walls edged melted snow to cook millet. Fires grew small, timber grew scarce. Detachments sent south for supplies often returned with less than they carried out. And with every forced requisition from neighboring tribes, promises made in Latin turned brittle in translation. Where the empire had once offered protection, it now demanded tribute. Where soldiers came offering peace, they now demanded pigs. Governors, appointed more for patronage than geographic sense, were slow to grasp the shift. The Frisians near the North Sea, once quiet traders of cattle and hides, grew sullen as garrisons demanded grain midwinter without payment. In one bitter campaign, when a detachment in the Lower Rhine drained a local village of its oats, entire cattle herds vanished into the woods by nightfall. Trade ceased. Informants dried up. The border thickened not with enemy warbands, but with silence. Further along the Danube, auxilia recruited from among the same border peoples were caught in contradiction. They wore Roman mail and bore Roman blades, but their mothers hauled grain from fields now stripped by Roman officers. In Pannonia, tense patrols passed villages that once cheered their arrival, but now offered shut doors. Soldiers grew alert, then unsure. Loyalty born of oaths was no match for hunger born of injustice. No rescriptum from the emperor could mend this. The imperial center understood harvest, grain, doli, and the flow of taxes. But the rhythms beyond the limes, of winter soil, barter economies, and tribal diplomacy, fell outside the census. Strategic reserves prepositioned in autumn were often too few and too rotten by spring. Even when roads cleared, disgrace followed the tardy convoys. By the time the stores reached Castra, half the units had reduced rations, and the other half had begun to barter armor for beans. And yet discipline held. Soldiers adapted. Some traded bronze vessels for native grains. Some struck quiet deals with tribal chieftains, grain in exchange for protection. Others foraged too far, and their bones were later found just beyond tree lines, ice-preserved reminders of risk and desperation. Winter became a test not of swordsmanship, but of storage strategy, of how deeply the name of Rome could feed soldiers when barley failed. In a letter now lost but cited by Cassius Dio, one legate near the Rhaetian frontier lamented that, "We conquer with empty hands." Plutarch recounts that soldiers on a German winter post warmed themselves not by fire, but by superstitio, placing laurel on camp altars to invoke piety and Mars. Archaeology near Vindolanda has uncovered tablets of supply complaints, one noting, "No oil, no flour, no morale." Each season drained more than resources. It wore down trust between governors and locals, between officers and men, between center and frontier. And as spring thawed the northern forests, the real danger lay, not in fresh rebellion or open revolt, but in brittle alliances and tribes who no longer listened, only watched. By then the vexilla still fluttered, but no longer drew reverence. When grain spoiled and nerves frayed, the Cordillera Cantabrica, northern Hispania, summer of 25 BCE. The hills were wet with mist, and the granite slopes held water like sponges. Here Augustus' generals pushed deeper into Cantabrian territory, determined to conclude the long, bitter struggle that had consumed nearly a decade of the imperial project in Hispania. But while the legions advanced with pila and forged steel, it was grain, not iron, that ultimately decided the tempo of war. Each Roman miles carried a pack weighing some 30 kilograms on campaign. Most of this, besides arms and stakes for the marching castra, was food. The biscuit rations, or buxulatum, were baked hard to resist decay. But in the Cantabrian uplands, weeks of unseasonal rain turned watertight sacks into dripping bundles. Rations crumbled. Green fungus crawled over packed bread like a second skin. Forager patrols returned lean and empty-handed. Cantabrian guerrillas had stripped fields ahead of Roman pillagers. With each sodden morning, the granaries thinned. Soldiers began to trade gear for scraps from local huts, often to the resentment of those they meant to subdue. Sick stomachs swelled across camp latrines as spoiled grain led to dysentery, sapping formation cohesion, and skewing the daily reports written by centurions to the legati. But worse than the physical toll was how famine unraveled the threads of honor sewn into Rome's non-Italian allies. The auxilia, native tribes conscripted or enticed into serving under Roman vexilla, were promised stipends, Roman citizenship after service, and most immediately regular food beneath the eagle standards. They came from the Vascones, the Vaci, and Gallic clans far across the mountains. But their loyalty was transactional, and when biscuit tins rotted and pay was delayed due to flooded wagon trails, their allegiance dissolved. Desertions began at the edges. A unit of legionaries failed to report to its evening signal post. A detachment of Celtiberians unshackled themselves from the baggage train and vanished into the tree line, leaving only their borrowed pila and a fire half-burned. Roman officers argued whether the cause was treachery or necessity, but the legati knew the underlying cause: empty bellies were not easily drilled into submission. No ideology carried a man across 20 miles of mountainous terrain without nourishment. The command chain attempted fast remedies. Marcus Agrippa, then overseeing logistics across Hispania, ordered emergency drying kilns constructed near the legionary castra. But smoke attracted ambushes, and in the wind-shattered ravines of the north, nothing dried faster than the bones of isolated patrols. Mule trains carrying fresh flour from the Ebro Valley arrived too slowly. Some supply boats offloaded near Gijon, but Cantabrian raiders knew the coastline too well. They burned one such shipment before the sacks could be shouldered inland. Cohor's morale dwindled not in battle, but over the communal cookpots. Contubernia argued over whose turn it was to man the hand mill or fetch wood. Puls stews turned thin. Some men subsisted solely on posca, wine vinegar and water, its sour bite dulling the stench of rot in bread. Officers attempted to rotate food assignments, but the firewood stores were damp, making cooking slower and less effective. A mood of suspicion thickened within the camps. Rumors flared that tribunes hoarded dry biscuits in sealed tents. A broken contract of food bred the very breakdown of Roman order itself. When Augustus arrived in person in 26 BCE to oversee the final phase of the war, he found his men less short on courage than on blood sugar. He reviewed the supply tables with a grim eye and canceled parades in favor of ration reform. Emergency requisitions were issued from Tarraco, conveyed via the cursus publicus. Local officials invoked imperium maius to compel grain from reluctant municipia. Yet even his presence, shrouded in auctoritas and flanked by the golden aquili, could not dry the forests or bind auxiliaries who had not eaten in days. A lightning strike felled a watchtower above the Pisuerga tributary, interpreted by some augurs as a prodigy of Rome's strained pax. As Suetonius records, Augustus fasted for a day and ordered a public supplicatio in Tarraco. But pious rites did not blunt the wind which howled down the valleys like a legion of ghosts, unsated by decayed grain. The Cantabrian Wars would end eventually with scorched Casella and chained hostages marched to Roman colonies. But their midpoint revealed the fragility of Roman conquest when severed from logistics. This was not incompetence, it was exposure. No empire, however vast, could command the clouds. And when grain vanished, so did Rome's grip. Beyond the hills, deeper into unsubdued territory, the rains fell heavier still. The next consignment of buxolatum, 3 weeks overdue, was last seen moored at Segisama, mired in rising floodwaters. Winter came early, and the eagles waited hungry. Mutiny over rations, the death of Augustus in 14 CE unsealed not only the political question of succession, but also the fragile trust between Rome and its provincial legions. Nowhere was that breach felt more acutely than along the Danubian frontier at Carnuntum in Pannonia. Their veteran soldiers of Legio VII Augusta and neighboring cohorts, long stationed in a region of harsh winters and limited local supply, watched the empire's transition not with pride but with growing unease. Their loyalty had been purchased by congiaria, imperial gifts, and promises of land, grain, and a share in the Pax Romana. But upon the passing of Augustus, those shipments faltered. Tiberius, newly emperor but reluctant to accept power, openly refused to leave Rome. Instead, the Senate dispatched his adoptive son Drusus the Younger to the mutinous camps. He arrived bearing lavish promises, gold coroni, and public feasts in the old republican tradition. Drusus hoped that spectacle and symbol might halt discontent, invoking the same theaters of magnanimity Augustus had once used. But Rome had misread the root of rebellion. The men did not ask for honors from a distant Senate. They demanded full grain rations, secure donativa, and land allocations codified under earlier lex agrariae. These were not luxuries, but necessities, critical assurances of bread and dignity after a lifetime in service. The legions survived on the annona militaris, the grain dole, administered via supply chains stretching from the granaries of Aquileia and Illyricum along the Cursus Publicus roads and riverine transport routes. In theory, each soldier received around 4 to 6 modi of wheat per month, but requisitions from local prefecti Annani had lapsed. Storehouses stood empty. When mules stumbled or river barges froze, mid-journey deliveries failed. In cold, foggy dawns, men tore into biscuit caches only to find green fungus instead of food. The castra once humming with routine, the clang of caligae on stone, the call of cornua at dawn, now rang hollow under the growls of unsated bellies. Men began to bivouac outside their tents, refusing orders. Decurions and centurions, once the spine of internal order, were ignored, insulted, or overthrown. One centurion, notorious for beatings and circuit punishments, was reportedly dragged through a latrine trench, flogged, and expelled from camp. It was no longer an army. It was a disbanded assembly with weapons, choosing delegates and airing grievances like aggrieved citizens on the forum's rostra. There is no difference, wrote Tacitus, between the army and the mob unless discipline makes one a sword. Drusus offered ludi tribute games and amphorae of resupplied wine, but this only inflamed tensions. Soldiers scoffed at theatrical appeasement. They required durable investment, grain not garlands, land not laurels. Many were veterans having served their full term, but denied the farmland once promised south of the Po. Others were new recruits, tyrants taken from the hills and coasts of Dalmatia and Noricum, scared, unpaid, and bound to a legion they barely understood. Honor in battle meant little to men who starved at the edge of an empire too silent to heed them. As rations dwindled, rations that symbolized their inclusion in the Roman world, so too did the binding pressure of Roman discipline. The wooden standards, icons of imperium, still stood in their shrines at the center of camp, but fewer saluted them. Vultures circled overhead. Fires burned unsanctioned through the night as assembled troops debated their options: full mutiny, desertion to the Dacian frontier, or march on Rome. No auspicium from the augurs had been taken. Grain or violence. There seemed no third path. The revolt in Pannonia did not erupt from foreign invasion or barbarian incursion. It came from within, from empty bread sacks, from plundered promises, from a Senate that sent laurel but not logistics. Archaeological strata from Carnuntum show signs of interrupted construction and ash layers, suggesting disorder and temporary abandonment. Drusus, forced to respond without imperial authority, assembled loyal praetorians and took a harder stance. Lines were formed. Executions were prepared. Threats stiffened spines. A partial restoration of Frementum calmed select units, but many veterans had seen too many lies flow from Rome's marbled halls. One Optio, scornful and raw from hunger, threw down his gladius and pointed toward the mountains. Their cries, Suetonius, the wolves eat better than we do. To the north, in Germania, similar fires smoldered. Germanicus, leading 8 legions along the Rhine, would soon face his own breakdown in camp, a breakdown sparked not by swords but by spoiled barley and broken trust. The Danube froze early that year, and so did the grain, the salt, and the circus. Eastern Mesopotamia, AD 115. Trajan's legions pushed deep beyond the margins of Rome's eastern frontier, threading columns through scorched plains and river valleys once ruled by Arsacid kings. The prize was Ctesiphon, jewel of the Parthian court. But as milestones fell behind and banners floated further from Antioch and Armenia, supply stretched thin across deserts that yielded neither bread nor shelter. Each soldier carried grain, yes, and salt rations to prevent collapse under heat. A measure of garum, fermented fish sauce, traveled in bone-sealed amphorae ready to flavor barley pulses against the numbing sameness of field meals. But as campaign weeks turned into months, those field stores could no longer sustain a force of imperial ambition, nor the appetites of an army that had come to expect a Roman standard of provisioning. The stipendium, the soldier's pay, was issued in denarii, but Eastern food markets priced in availability, not loyalty. With Roman silver flooding cities like Hatra and Seleucia, local traders hoarded and inflated. A sack of barley might sell for a week's wages, lentils for twice that. Coin became promise, not purchasing power. By imperial design, rations rested on three pillars. The Annona Rome's grain distribution apparatus contracted supply trains, often staffed by military slaves and private entrepreneurs, and local foraging requisitions, sanctioned by commanding officers. Trajan's advisors had calculated their needs, but they could not bend weather nor bribe terrain. A single storm in the upper Commagene route drowned a train of draft mules. Another washed out a bridge at the Euphrates crossing below Dura. The column veered south, closer to hostile Parthian cavalry and beyond the reach of scheduled deliveries. Within the castra, the rhythm of meals revealed supply stress before the officers could. Contubernia that once rotated barley porridge with bean gruel now ground teeth over hardened pulse cake baked with bone-black char. When vinegar supplies turned, soldiers drank ash-mixed water or risked dehydration. Along the eastern march, there were no vineyards, no familiar olive groves, no granaries loyal to Rome, or at least none willing to sell for hollowing coins. Some centurions, unable to ration increasingly worthless stipends, turned a blind eye to unofficial markets clustered just outside the camps. Here, retired locals, camel drivers, even Persian defectors sold flatbread, dried apricots, mutton fat. Prices bruised the dignity of proud legions, but hunger choked outrage. Veterans who once saluted their tribune now bartered with camp followers for crusts of black bread, whispered trade in dusky corners far from the Principia. The loyalty that had marched with Trajan from Italia had not shattered, but it bent, subtly, quietly, beneath the pressure of salted hunger. Trajan responded with ceremony and coin. He ordered fresh garum amphorae unloaded near the Khabur crossing. A consignment of Iberian salt was shipped at great expense from Antioch's reserves. Public distribution resumed in full view of the ranks, flanked by standards and centered by orators. But the inflation had reached the bones of the war. Each denarius bought less. Each loaf traveled further through danger to reach its eater. Rome's control was not broken, but its confidence suffered a slow bleeding. In the east, even victory could spoil. When Ctesiphon fell, it yielded no feast. Stores were locked, torched, or stripped by the retreating Arsacid forces. Roman scouts reported fields burned ahead of their line. Parthian farmers under orders had cut the grain to soil and salted the root. Trajan took the city, razed statues, struck coins. But the legions ate little in triumph. Back in the camps, rumors moved faster than orders, that the paymasters would reduce rations by half. That local scouts had been bribed to mislead supply convoys, that the Parthians had emptied wells on the road to Susa. Centurions walked the evening watches with sharper awareness, not of attack but of collapse. For a soldier unarmed is dangerous, a soldier unfed even more so. As Rome spent fortune and steel securing eastern conquests, the urgency moved not through battle lines but bread lines. The eastern wind carried with it another hazard, not arrows but inflation, drought, and the hollow silence of an army staring down its own limits. Food became fate, and every stretched wagon axle marked the distance between empire and endurance. Gods of the field, oven in the quiet before breaking camp, some Roman soldiers turned not to drill or dice, but to ritual. As the first tendrils of smoke curled from field ovens, a handful of men knelt beside the embers, pitching handfuls of grain into the fire. Sometimes barley, sometimes cracked farro or millet. The act was simple, even crude: no priest, no altar, only the burning of seed to invoke divine favor. Yet in that small gesture lay generations of martial tradition. In frontier units or auxiliary cohorts in the Balkans, and beyond, the offerings went to Silvanus. the rustic god of woods and uncultivated land, or in more disciplined ranks to Mars Gradivus, divine patron of the march, not just of war. It was an appeal made not in temples, but in marching camps beside earth pits and mule carts to gods, not of Olympus, but of the trail, the forest, and the open field gods of the field oven. Roman military religion was pragmatic. It bound men to a sense of order, duty, and place. The genius of the legion itself was divine, honored with images in headquarters. Centurions offered on behalf of their centuries, tribunes invoked Jupiter Optimus Maximus before battle. Religion stabilized morale and hierarchy, but food, and the fear of losing it, was where belief touched the belly. A spoiled ration might be as dangerous as an ambush, a missed shipment more demoralizing than a skirmish. If the crops failed near a garrison post in Mosia or Britannia, men remembered who had and hadn't offered tribute last week. Some rites were rooted in ancient rural customs, revived in military form. Slightly charred meal left before a night march, a feathered branch raised before foraging in contested land, cramped prayers muttered before grinding grain. These were meant to ward off blight, spoilage, and discovery by enemy patrols. Roman military engineering could build roads across marshes, but it could not halt mildew, nor could the cursus honorum reward a tribune who let bread go moldy in spring rain. So centurions encouraged rites that fortified food just as they hardened spears or oiled scabbards. But by the 3rd century, doctrine met disruption. Christianity, once confined to scattered assemblies in the East, had sunken roots among the rankers. Soldiers baptized in secret now refused public libations performed at morning assemblies. Intra-cohort tensions flickered into full rebukes when a Miles or Decurio refused to cast barley upon the fire or stood silent during prayers to Mars. Officers appealed to discipline, but the challenge was spiritual and collective. The traditional pax deorum, the peace of the gods, had been a matter of state, not private opinion. Yet now units fractured. Some carried small tokens of sainted martyrs sewn into tunics, others guarded older traditions with rigid suspicion. By the time of Diocletian, the contradiction was open. Edicts required loyalty oaths under the old gods. Some soldiers accepted them in silence or defiance. Others, especially in the East, quietly supplemented practice, with newer rites breaking bread without invocation, murmuring Greek psalms instead of Latin formulas. The tension was never only about belief, it was about risk. If the food spoiled after a prayerless night, could it be seen as divine punishment? And if not, were the gods indifferent or simply absent? What mattered most in the moment of hunger was not theology, but cohesion. Yet too often belief pulled at supply lines worse than rain or overextension. A centurion in Dalmatia might enforce an offering today only to see half his contubernium rejected 2 months later during Lent. Chaplains were still rare. Unit cohesion depended on century loyalty and shared meals. In the past, the field oven had fed not just flesh but trust. Now it became an ember of dispute, whether to light it in silence, prayer, or defiant refusal. The rituals did not vanish overnight. Even into the late 4th century, altars to Mars and Silvanus stood beside Roman camps in Noricum, Rhaetia, and the northern highways into Pannonia. But with each generation, fewer men knelt beside the fire. The legions that once marched under both discipline and divinity now navigated a fractured terrain. Supply routes compromised not solely by weather or distance, but by belief itself. As soldiers stretched dwindling meals and sought signs among smoke, the line between sacred rite and superstition grew thinner. In battalions teetering on the edge of structure and survival, a burned offering might divide the tent more than any foreign enemy. And as the empire ranged wider and leaned heavier on federated troops unschooled in either rite, the fires meaning cooled, leaving only ash and uncertainty. The grain ships burn in the late summer of 269 CE. The sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean grew silent. Along the crucial grain routes from Alexandria to the imperial heartland sails, once white with Egypt's wind, blackened with fire instead. Pomeran ships, Fleets of swift, shallow-drafted raiders drawn from Cilician and Phoenician coasts struck deep-burning wheat transports near Crete and the Nile Delta. The attack, sanctioned by Queen Zenobia's expanding Pomeranian regime, was timed with lethal precision. Emperor Aurelian, occupied with reinforcing the Danube frontier, could not divert troops or ships fast enough. With the Annona broken, the bread stopped coming. From the woods of Pannonia to the hill camps of Moesia, grain fatigue spread like infection. Weekly rations failed. Commissariat officers posted daily reductions in camp forums. Hardtack, a soldier's fallback when soft bread failed, was rationed and then gone. Soldiers trained to discipline, and margin began scavenging. First came organized foraging bands, then desperate detachments seizing what lay nearby. Storehouses, villas, even temple grain reserves. In cities like Sirmium and Viminacium, citizens watched armed Roman soldiers break open their own reserves to feed the legions that were meant to protect them. The Roman army on campaign operated with portable logistics, but not self-sufficiency. Each soldier carried a standard day's ration: grain for panis militaris, a bit of salt, sometimes dried legumes, and marched with a burden of nearly 30 kilograms. This stood for endurance, not autonomy. Behind them, the machinery of supply mules pulling carts of amphory wagons laden with sacks, barges, drifting their heavy freight through canal and river. Alexandria's wheat alone fed the equivalent of 150 Roman mouths daily. Its disruption turned legions from fed instruments of the emperor's will into mobile mouths with swords. In the Danubian provinces, garrisons received orders to dig less, entrenchments reduced to conserve energy. Burned villages between the Sava and the Drava offered little food and few friends. Aurelian's staff requisitioned oxen and donkeys from the same tribal settlements they had just pacified. In Noricum, emissaries sent to secure grain came back beaten, or not at all. Aurelian's commanders allowed greater leeway to tribunes, letting them purchase or seize food from where they could. This decentralization, pragmatic under pressure, fostered new rivalries and old resentments. Some villages aligned with Gothic bands hiding in the forests north of the Save, others fled entirely, abandoning fields to fallow and livestock to wolves. The emperor's intelligence briefings delivered by mounted speculators grew grim. Logistical lines could not be restored without clearing the Aegean, but Rome lacked the naval power in the east since Gallienus had drawn ships west. The fleet at Ravenna could not reach Egypt fast enough. Aurelian sent a desperate order to divert Balkan grain stores from Thessalonica and Corinth. Merchants protested. Civic authorities refused briefly, but prefects of equestrian rank enforced the order with tax threats and sword. The wheat began moving north, but the delay cost 3 weeks. On the Danube, soldiers grew more reckless. Camp kitchens, the communal feeding hearths that held together 8-man contubernia, ran cold. Men cooked alone, squabbling over charred millet or sour beans, hoarding salt. Ovens cracked from frost and overuse. Fires burned hotter than needed, wasting fuel in the chilled air. One auxiliary cohort near Carnuntum refused to march on campaign day unless fed. A tribune relented, diverting another unit's remaining rations. Petty mutinies passed like fevers, short, intense, deadly if neglected. Yet Aurelian's campaign did not break. In a harsh campaign season along the upper Moesian frontier, his legions outmaneuvered and defeated the Gothic coalition that had wrecked Roman cities south of the river. The emperor entered Singidunum with a garland of victory, and a capital city terrified of the soldiers who brought it. Survivors remembered not the battles, but the foraging, the wheat taken without coin, the dried fruit reserves seized for half-starved scouts, the village elders beaten for refusing what they had already given. The empire had retained its border but lost a portion of its trust. To feed his army, Aurelian had fed upon his provinces. As winter approached, the restored grain flow from Egypt began to reach Ravenna and then upwards. But a deeper fracture lingered beneath the returning shipments. Local elites, once loyal, now calculated cautiously. Should Palmyra strike again, or the Goths regroup? The loyalty of the frontier cities could no longer be assumed. The imperial grain fleet, restored but vulnerable, would sail under wary skies. The next rupture might not halt at hunger alone. Eating the enemy's land, eating the enemy's land. Beneath the late sun of Mesopotamia in 363 CE, the last pagan emperor of Rome led his legions eastward into the lands of the Sasanian king Shapur II. Flanked by the Euphrates on one side and barren steppe on the other, Julian's invasion force pushed deeper into Persia than any emperor since Trajan. The campaign had begun with shouted oaths, full granaries, and prophetic confidence. Julian divided his forces in bold fashion. One column would sweep south from Armenia while his own war host, some 60 strong, advanced down the Euphrates corridor bearing grain for only 90 days. This was a war not of attrition but of seizure. Julian gambled on feeding Rome's army by devouring Persian land. At first, the eagle standards moved like fire through dry grass. Cities fell, palaces burned. But Julian faced enemies more enduring than any battlefield maneuver: distance, hunger, and flame. Sasanian generals skilled in what Ammianus called ratio parthica, the art of retreat and fire, refused decisive engagement. Instead, they pulled back steadily, drawing Roman infantry across vast, blistering terrain. Each village was found hollowed and torched. Fields were cut low to their roots. Wells were poisoned with lime or dung. Smoke rose ahead of the legions like a mocking omen. This was not failure of Roman arms, but exposure of logistical limits. The Annona, Rome's grand grain system of ship, mule, and mill, could not reach this far. Julian's men had surpassed the reach of the cursus publicus, trusted neither river nor ford, and bore their own burdens. To lighten the march, centurions ordered the abandonment of anything that could not be eaten or wielded. Wagons were dismantled. Armor was shed. Even the heavy ballistae and battering rams were left by the roadside. Only the aquila remained spotless, polished daily, its glint a lone emblem of order amid disorder. For a time, Julian masked the growing peril. The army foraged, breaking into scattered groves for hard barley. Thistle roots were boiled. The taste turned the strongest man to retch. Still, Julian performed as both commander and priest. From his tent he offered sacrifices, oxen, doves, incense to Jupiter and Sol Invictus. Entrails were read daily, but the signs turned limp and dry. A thunderless sky gave neither answer nor shade. Desperate to sustain cohesion, Julian paraded captured Persian rustics before the men, ash-streaked, wretched, exhausted beyond speech, as proof that the enemy suffered worse. But the legion's veterans of Gaul and the Danube could see through the pageant. They felt their thighs weaken. Calligi cracked from heat. Scuda became burdens. Some auxiliaries from Syria drifted into the shadows and were not seen again. Still, the march pressed on. Fires were built only rarely, even a faint curl of smoke risked drawing Sasanian scouts. By nightfall, camps were scraped into the earth. A ring of shivering men wrapped in worn sagum, their mess pots dry. Flesh, when found, often came from dead pack mules. Horses dropped fast. Leather turned to food. Julian's great fleet had once mirrored the land advance, sailing in convoy down the Euphrates, bearing flour, garum, wine, oil, each amphora a ration of empire. But Persian raiders, low river depths, and Julian's own decision to torch the boats at Al-Walid shattered that support. He burned his bread for speed, wrote Ammianus, but caught emptiness instead. With Ctesiphon unreachable, the gates held and the defenders agile, Julian turned north toward Corduene, seeking to join the Armenian column and restore the chain of resupply. The pivot came too late. Outside Samarra, squadrons of Persian cavalry harried the flanks. In the chaos of charges, retreat feints, and dust masks, Julian was pierced by a javelin below the ribs. He refused evacuation. Surrounded by shouting guards and clashing tubi, he bled slowly into the sand. A comet was later reported to pagan eyes a summons. He died without a successor. Command devolved to Jovian, a cautious officer of the imperial guard, elevated amid confusion and grief. But imperium held little meaning among starving men. Jovian's legions clad in rags tore bark from trees, scoured dung for undigested seeds. Ammianus estimated they had less than 10 days of food remaining. The return march was improvised, not commanded. It followed paths where the Sasanians allowed escape, shadowed by horse archers who loosed arrows without pressing. No pitched battle came, just the slow collapse of formation and faith. Beside the upper Tigris, negotiations were hastily arranged. Jovian, his army listless, conceded Nisibis and 5 fortified districts in exchange for grain and passage, a humiliating peace heavy in both symbolism and loss. Imperial banners once held high were now stained with river mud. Inside, the Castra whispers turned not to Mars or virtues, but to vinegar-wine and the missed rations of Rome. The army limped home degraded and disillusioned. Julian's vision, Rome crowned by Saturn breaking the east stars, perished not by Persian spear but beside cold ashes and empty mills. At the Euphrates delta, smoke still rose, and the legions behind them would soon face betrayal within. Barbarian bellies Roman bred by the late 4th century CE, the Roman army's dependence on supply chains was more than a matter of logistics. It had become a question of imperial survival. Along the Thracian frontier near Marcianople, modern-day Devnya in northeastern Bulgaria, the pressures of feeding Rome's new federated allies exposed the brittle core of an overstretched system. The policy was simple in theory: offer food instead of full pay. Amid chronic fiscal deficits and mounting troop shortages, Roman generals, acting under imperial sanction, invited large Gothic contingents into the empire, not as enemies, but as federati allies under their own leaders pledged to defend Roman frontiers in exchange for land and sustenance. Following the catastrophic Hunnic incursions across the Danube in 376, entire Gothic tribes had been absorbed under emergency terms championed by Emperor Valens. But as the harvests failed, Africa's grain exports wavered, and unscrupulous local officials sought personal gain, the theory of bounty gave way to the reality of betrayal. In and around Marcianople, grain promised to Gothic camps was withheld. Officials sold the annona into private hands. In the worst cases, desperate Gothic warriors were offered dog meat in place of grain rations. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman officer and eyewitness to the Valens era, records the bitter humiliations suffered by the Gothic refugees. Once warriors, now reduced to beggar, ranks their weapons surrendered at crossing, their tribal chiefs disarmed by Roman duplicity. These men had not crossed the frontier to conquer, but to survive. Now, with their children starving and the terms of their foedus broken, these same men chose revolt. Yet this collapse of diplomacy through misconduct was not merely a moral failure. It was a failure of Roman provisioning at scale. Since the 2nd century, BCE field armies had relied on the annona militaris, military grain distributions funded through provincial requisitions. Garrison troops on imperial borders, whether along the Rhine-Danube or eastern desert roads, required thousands of modii of wheat and barley annually. But this bureaucratic engine was vulnerable to greed, to distance, to weather, and to the ambiguity inherent in contracting foreign strength to uphold Roman arms. This was not the first time war erupted from empty bellies. As early as the Augustan era, military discontent had followed dwindling rations. The mutinies in Pannonia under Tiberius' command had spiraled partly from spoiled grain shipments and broken consular promises. But what changed by the late 4th century was Rome's increasing reliance on non-citizen troops, poorly supervised and barely integrated, whose trust in Roman honor proved as perishable as their food stocks. In early 377, as Gothic warbands erupted in anger across Thrace, Roman legions scrambled to respond. But units stationed in nearby Moesia were under strength and regional depots had not been replenished in time. Supply lines thinned not only under the weight of long roads and deep forests, but under the spread of revolt. Convoys were ambushed, pack animals, stolen fields burned in reprisal. What had once been a provisioning crisis now became a civil-military catastrophe. Valens underestimated the threat, refused to wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian. Instead, he committed to battle near Adrianople the following year, where two-thirds of his army would vanish beneath Gothic spears. But long before the first arrow was loosed, or the emperor lay dead on the field, the real seeds of collapse had been scattered into the soil of neglect. The Roman military's logistical culture, so carefully honed in earlier centuries, built on roads, mules, porters, and seasonal supply fleets, had frayed under pressure. What remained was a hollow promise that men who owed Rome their service would be fed in return. In Thrace, that oath splintered, and with it the illusion of Rome's control over its provincial allies. Even after the ashes of Adrianople cooled, the policy of feeding federates continued, less from strength than necessity. By then, the empire's borders had become more corridor than wall, and Rome could not patrol them without foreign hands. But every sack of grain now carried more than calories. It bore the weight of deferred obligations, quiet resentment, and a growing knowledge among foreign tribes that Rome's word no longer held the solidity of stone. And as winter crept again into the Balkan hills, more mouths clamored at doors already empty. Empty granaries at the inn. By the mid-5th century, the world of Roman arms had grown bitter and thin. The granaries of Rome, once swollen with the wheat of Africa Proconsularis, Carthago's lifeblood, now yawned open and empty. In 439 CE, the Vandals under Gaiseric seized Carthage, and with it the breadbasket of the Western Empire. The flow of grain, a river of ships, tax levies, docks, and storage pits, was not merely interrupted, it was severed. Africa's fields had fed not only the city of Rome, but the frontier legions from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. The annona, that central obligation of empire, crumbled in silence. A legion without bread was not merely hungry, it was weakened in spirit, shortened in range, and slower in arm. Soldiers still gathered around fire pits in contubernia, the 8-man mess units welded together by routine and necessity. Clay pots still boiled when grain could be found, but in place of nourishing barley or wheat came hedge-grown greens, foraged roots, offal soaked in sour wine if wine remained. Cutting trees for fuel risked stripping borderlands, provoking locals, or choking camps in smoke. Without proper rations, training degraded. Physical resilience eroded. Recruits, drawn often now from hastily levied sons of peasants or among reluctant barbarian federates, entered service with rumbling bellies and no experience of campaign rigors. The stable flows of imperial supply had once been judged by their reliability, not excess. A soldier on the Danube in the reign of Marcus Aurelius could expect grain, salt, olive oil, and vinegar-based rations, supplemented by whatever was gathered locally or bought from sutlers. By the 4th century, that calculus reversed. Garrisons hoarded when they could. Provinces evaded annona quotas. Civilians bribed corrupt officials to avoid requisition detachments. Defensive lines like the Rhine and the Alpine crossings were starved not by battle but by neglect. Desertion rose, but more insidious was the decline of discipline. In earlier centuries, a soldier drilled between marches built fortifications, maintained marching order. But without food, without the daily ritual of rations distributed, of millstones grinding, of grain boiled into pulse, there could be no cohesion. Officers could no longer enforce decimation or threat of lash. They too went hungry. The promise of donatives, land grants, and future payment in coin or kind rang hollow against the immediate scraping of spoons on empty pots. Even units reinforced by barbari foederati grew restive. In return for defending imperial borders, Gothic or Alan warbands had been granted the right to settle and to draw grain rations. But those annona distributions fell behind. Grain trains from Africa had stopped. The few remaining storehouses in Italia and Sicily served Rome first and the army last. In Thrace and Illyria, federate troops turned on Roman cities when issued animal feed instead of flour, or when tax officials issued payment in adulterated wine and salted beans unfit for draft animals. The symbolic collapse of the Western Army came not in rout, but in kitchens gone cold. Recruitment rolls shrank not only because men refused the burden of arms, but because officers could not promise food. When rations dwindled, some garrisons bartered for survival. In Noricum, commanders offered plowshares and rusted shields to local tribes in exchange for grain. In Numidia, remnants of Roman forces sold weapons to desert brigands for sacks of millet. Each campfire came with risk of betrayal, of starvation, of being found too late by help that no longer came. The imperial court, by now fractured between Ravenna and what influence remained in Gaul, could muster proclamations, not provisions. Edicts preserved the fiction of annona allocations. Governors levied taxes in cereal and oil they could not enforce. Proconsuls pleaded for naval escorts to protect the few grain ships still capable of sailing from Sardinia or the Balearics. But piracy, storms, and indifference eroded even these fragile lines. Rome itself, stripped of its authority, grew dependent on subsidies from its own enemies. By 442, Gaisaric's Africa supplied not Rome's troops, but his own Vandal warriors. Roman officials, desperate to prevent further sackings, negotiated shipments of grain into Italia as part of peace arrangements. Wheat that had once borne the seal of the consuls now stamped with barbarian markings. The empire had begun to feed at the hands of those it once subjugated. What remained of the legions ate less, trained less, obeyed less. But the worst affliction was not found in the bellies of seasoned veterans, but in the eyes of those who came after, young men who donned Roman armor without ever tasting Roman order. For them, service promised neither honor nor reward, only cold tents and cracked loaves. Some would still stand to defend outposts along the Alps or the flamines of coastal fortresses. But increasingly, when food failed and command fell silent, the last Roman did not stand. He left, and behind him the fire pit flickered out unattended as silence took the place once held by order's comradeship and the grain of empire. What had been the diet of conquest now became the hunger of decline. Ahead, sharper than any spear, loomed the long, cold shadow of collapse. The last meal of empire by the waning days of the Western Roman Empire. A storm gathered not in the heavens, but under the cookfires of the frontier. In Noricum, nestled along the crumbling Danube limes, and in Mauritania, half forgotten, along the African rim, the Roman soldier's ration had become unrecognizable. Where once a legionary received a measured allotment of grain, his modius of wheat, salt, oil, and the promise of the annona, now he boiled barley with pine bark, stirred lentils thickened with ash, and prayed not to fall in battle, but to outlast hunger. This was not how the machine of Rome had been built. For centuries, the diet of the soldier was systematized, a mixture of portability, predictability, and imposed discipline. On the march, each legionary bore nearly 30 kilograms of kit, armor, tools, weapons, and his ration, a measured parcel of raw grain, sometimes 2 weeks' worth. He ground it with a hand mill, mixed it with water or bits of rendered lard, and cooked it over shallow fire pits or in shared clay pots. 8 men to a contubernium, 1 tent, 1 shared kitchen. Their meals: puls, a thin barley porridge; panis militaris, coarse bread; posca, vinegary wine diluted by water, sustained them not with indulgence but with ritual regularity. It was less cuisine than command. But the empire was not carried on the backs of infantry. It moved by mule and merchant, by the coastal grain ships from Egypt, Sicily, and Africa proconsularis that fed the garrisons of the Rhine and the outposts of Dacia. Supply hubs, Horia and major fortresses, stored grain and salted pork; ox carts and river barges moved provisions up the Rhone, down the Rhine, across the Alps. Coordination between procurators, army prefects, and local civitates underpinned Rome's martial appetite. Yet every link relied on road integrity, climate rhythm, loyal suppliers, and imperial solvency. As the West unraveled, these links snapped in silence. With the conquest of Carthage by the Vandals in 439 CE, the grain ships from Africa ceased. For Rome, this cut not merely trade but lifeline. The Annona, once the predictable pulse of order, failed. In Gaul, petty warbands seized tolls from convoys. In Britain, abandoned by Honorius in 410, no grain moved at all. Provisional commanders implored Ravenna for supplies that would never plunge through barbarian-held valleys. Legions assigned to frontier defense now lived off local tax in kind or did without, stretching stored grain until it turned green and sour until discipline buckled. Inside the walls of detached basilicas and hilltop castra, the last true Romans did not toast conquest with Falernian wine, but chewed hard biscuit soaked in vinegary water, calling it supper. Some requisitioned from terrified peasants. Others turned to barter, swapping broken loricae for eggs or swords for wild onions. Few had families nearby. Recruits drawn from Pannonia, Dacia, even the eastern highlands, now stranded in a world no longer linked by roads or governed by edicts. With no treasuries to pay the stipendium, no warehouses to draw provisions, and no legates to issue orders, they improvised and then starved. In Mauritania Caesariensis, garrisons entrusted to monitor the caravans from inland Numidia faded, their correspondence unanswered. Soldiers dug fire pits in windswept highlands, scraping up roots, feeding on wild figs when they could. Salt, once rationed under Octavian, became more valuable than bronze. A cohort that once guarded the imperial roads now huddled under makeshift palisades from palm trunks, boiling lizards and half-rotted grain. In Noricum, the frost set early. With the Alpine passes impassable, and the warehouse at Lauriacum empty, centuries who once issued inspection orders now spent days parsing what moss could be boiled down. No mutiny erupted. There was no battle lost nor standard taken. It took no Gothic siege, no hail of Pannonian javelins. Instead, absence hollowed the ranks. Once one contubernium could not feed itself, it fractured. Some slipped away into the forests to forage, others trudged south towards cities that no longer provisioned them. Still more, their bellies sunken and uniforms patched with fur or nothing at all, slipped into native villages and vanished as Romans. There were no last parades, no dying salutes to consuls or emperors. Just the fading echo of boots, no longer marching, the silence of ovens grown cold, and the slow erasure of order where once discipline held the line. Somewhere on the frontier, in the brittle dawn of a year, no longer recorded, a lone guardsman scraped the bottom of a pot for ash-thick stew, glanced at the horizon for couriers who would never come, and folded into the long hunger. And beyond that horizon, the forests thickened, the roads cracked, and winter moved again. How Roman soldiers ate, cooked, and shared food on campaign. In 9 CE, deep in the Teutoburg forest, 3 Roman legions under Varus fought for survival amid torrential rain, thick mud, and hostile Germanic terrain. Cut off from supply lines and encircled by ambushing tribes, the legions faced starvation even before their swords were drawn. Each soldier, from legionary to auxilia, was allocated 0.8 kg of grain per day. Barely enough when fires could not be lit and mules collapsed in the mire. Within sodden castra or roadside halts, men boiled lentils, pounded grain, and rationed hardtack, the scent of vinegar and smoke mingling with congealed blood. But what they ate shaped how long they held. Supplies failed before sword points did. Rations of empire, the Roman soldier moved not merely through terrain, but through time reckoned in hunger. Rations were the pulse of the marching line, measured in grain, salt, vinegar, and silence. Each legionary laden with around 30 kilograms. His sarsena bearing spare tunic, cooking equipment, rations for several days, and the tools of both war and survival, could not long sustain himself without the muscular hand of the state behind him. The emperor's reach from the banks of the Rhine to the deserts of Arabia Petrea depended on the fragile arteries of the Annona Militaris mules, on muddy causeways, riverboats slipping through fog, requisition, agents bartering or robbing provincial barns before winter sealed the roads. One failed convoy and Caesar's legions might eat grass, while enemy scouts counted their ribs. The daily backbone of the legion was not the sword but the puls, a porridge thick with barley or wheat, stirred slowly in low clay pots blackened from campfire smoke. 8 men formed a contubernium, the smallest unit of moral and physical cohesion, and cooked together. One might kneel to grind grain with a portable quern. Another stirred a third fan the fire while watching for flickers of smoke which might betray their position faster than any fleeing deserter. In campaign camps, carefully dug fire pits were placed near tents hidden under hastily raised brush when deep in hostile woodlands. Where wood was scarce or wet discipline met its bitterest enemy, not in the sword but in the stomach that refused to wait. Luxury played no part. Wine sent to legions was often sour and diluted the sharp posca that curled the tongue but refreshed weary limbs after a march. It was no Falernian vintage suitable for poets or senators. Without regular wine shipments from southern provinces, or when amphorae cracked over jagged stones in shallow rivers, morale sagged and irritation spread. Grain might keep a legion upright, but poor drink made it restless, querulous, prone to rumor. Vinegar postponed disease, but it could not replace a spree. Far from Rome, supply became its own campaign. On the limes Germanicus, or beneath the gray skies of Britannia, winter unspooled the logic of Roman logistics until it snapped. Roads vanished under snowdrifts, wagons stuck axle-deep in frozen trails, oxen collapsed, their hides steaming in the frosty air. Storage pits dug hastily in thaw soured by January. For food, governors turned to requisition, more often veiled theft than barter. Nearby tribes, once pliant, grew sullen and calculating, weighing the worth of Rome's discipline against the hunger of Roman garrisons. When food spoiled, alliance turned fragile. During the Cantabrian campaigns in Hispania under Augustus' sudden rains, drowned biscuit stores and swelled mold into hardtack. Allied troops from the highlands, unpaid and underfed, withdrew not from treachery but from famine. Their loyalty, always brittle, dissolved into the mist-covered foothills, leaving tired Roman legions to forage through hostile terrain now emptied of both wheat and dependence. Food could incite more than desertion. It could draw the sword. In 14 CE, following Augustus, death legions stationed in Pannonia mutiny. Promises made in marble and bronze, grants of land, cash, and grain, had withered into symbolic gesture. Soldiers did not want feasts for display. They wanted their monthly allotment in fixed measure, relief from hunger and assurance that their sons would not inherit starvation. Tiberius. Envoys offered theater. The troops responded with blunt steel and demands rooted not in insubordination but survival. Even in triumph, the empire dined with care. During Trajan's eastern campaigns, legions took their due in measured salt, dried fish, sheep cheese, and jars of precious garum. Yet the markets of Armenia and Parthia proved cruel. Prices soared beyond stipendium speculation, rotted morale, and opportunists fat, while veterans bartered looted coins for bread. Supply here was measured less in discipline than in denarii, the rising tide of silver eroding beneath each soldier's foot. In this setting, superstition clung like sweat. Soldiers offered burnt grain kernels to Mars Gradavis before each march, muttered oaths over field ovens, begged Silvanus to ward off rot and weevil. Yet as Christianity gained ground within the ranks, practiced rites turned to points of tension. Some scorned them as pagan nonsense, others clung to them as the last barrier between order and starvation. The knife edge of supply was sharpened further by sabotage. In 269 CE, as Aurelian fought on the Danube, pirates operating under Pomeranian control set fire to grain convoys en route from Alexandria. Egypt's bread, upon which so many legions depended, now arrived weeks late or not at all. Troops scoured like scavengers through ruined cities, feeding themselves on fear and grudge. The army endured, but local trust, once betrayed, was not easily sown anew. And when Rome pushed east under Julian in 363, it was wheat, not arrows, that undid the campaign. Persian defenders burned their own fields, poisoned their wells, and retreated behind ruined harvests. The Roman army found no battle, but marched into famine. Julian himself would fall not from ambush, but from strategic malnutrition. His death crowned a campaign undone not by spears, but by empty granaries. The empire could force loyalty with coin discipline, with lashes conquest with swords, but it could never fully control its food. The next fire might not burn scrolls or temples, but granaries. The next fall might not be a city, but a winter shipment missed. Hunger, Rome's most patient enemy, never charged the front gate. It waited by the cookfire. The legion's portable kitchen in the heart of a Roman marching camp, on the damp soil of Gaul, the dry plains of Syria, or the wooded edges of Pannonia. The fire was as crucial as the pilum. Each contubernium, a unit of 8 soldiers, carried not just arms, but a semblance of home, a hand mill, a clay cooking pot, a leather water skin, and a measure of grain. This was their kitchen, mobile and austere, and it traveled with them in panniers slung over mules' backs. The core of the legion's diet was the pulse pot, puls, a thick porridge of barley or wheat boiled with water, sometimes livened with lentils, chickpeas, or shreds of pickled meat from salted rations. Olive oil, if available, or animal fat rendered from battlefield livestock added richness. Salt was precious, pepper rarer, still garum. The fermented fish sauce, so prized in Rome, traveled poorly, and only in small ceramic amphorae reserved for officers and centurions. The daily routine of the legionary included hours of digging, marching, and drill, but always also the simple, repetitive labor of sustenance, grinding grain between stones, gathering fuel, tending fire. Yet even this basic task bore military danger. Fire revealed movement. In hostile territory, fields were watched and forests echoed with unseen eyes. Roman fire lines were not merely culinary, they were tactical decisions. A cook's smoke could betray an entire column. Thus, fires were often dug low into the earth, heated with dry wood to minimize smoke, or lit only at dusk under cover of darkness. In rain-bound campaigns like those in Germania, campfires were hard to light, and fuel was scarce. Soldiers stripped bark, gathered dung, or burned broken equipment. The need for hot food contended fiercely with the need to remain hidden. The art of cooking was communal. A contubernium shared one tent and ate from one pot. Camaraderie was forged in labor and hunger alike. The same hands that gripped javelins stirred wooden spoons. Military discipline ensured order. Each man knew his duty: to fetch, to grind, to boil, to clean. Centurions enforced it not just for efficiency, but for morale. Emperors and generals recognized the relationship between order and the stomach. A fed soldier was a loyal one, and even the thin barley veneer of Roman civilization had to be maintained, one ladle at a time. Cooking implements were folded into the pack: bronze tripods, iron spits, foldable grates, leather pouches for salt. The fire pit was dug quickly upon halt, its size regulated. Men rationed out their flour and water from the grain supply measured at the start of each iter. Rations came sometimes in panis militaris, hard biscuit loaves baked ahead of time, or in raw grain distributed from granaries or store wagons. If bread ran short, they reverted to mush and roasted grains. Season dictated diet. Campaigning in summer meant some wild fruits, perhaps fish or game caught locally. In freezing winters, the pulse pot thickened with whatever could be foraged or carved. In Germania, archaeologists have uncovered traces of ground acorns and linden seeds, along with wheat chaff, suggesting the endurance of legions wintering near the Rhine depended on bitter improvisation. Though the Roman state maintained one of the ancient world's most sophisticated logistical systems, armored with contracts, measurement standards, and storage protocols, it still rested on fragile terrain. For every amphora of oil moved by ship from Hispania or Africa, there was the campfire. It must reach the hands, it must warm. The legion's kitchen stretched from the central horia of the capital to a blackened pot on the edge of the world. When the enemy cut supply lines, the first to know were the cooks. Lost mules flooded rivers raids on foraging parties. Each disruption sent longer lines to water and tighter belts at night. A pot without barley meant quarrels, and too many quarrels bred whispers. Hunger was not just physical but political. In frontier campaigns, policy turned to food. Governors kept peace not only with diplomacy but with grain. When a tribe resisted, the legions moved not only with swords but with cauldrons settling down to harvest their enemy's season. But that too risked exposing Roman fire to foreign eyes. Even within the perimeter of a secure marching camp surrounded by vallum and trench discipline, could fray when the food was late or spoiled. The grindstone's weight when felt amid fatigue and frost turned loyalty into question. A legion could march on its stomach, but only if its fire remained lit and its pot full. And in the growing shadows of Rome's later centuries, as shipments arrived late and foreign quartermasters cut corners, even this daily ritual, the pulse pot balanced on rock, the whisper of embers, began to falter. Bread and vinegar, not Bacchus, in the daily life of the Roman legionary. There was little of Dionysian indulgence and even less of culinary splendor. The Republic's poets sang of rustic simplicity, but army rations were harsher than pastoral verse. The soldier's plate bore no olives from Campania, no honeyed dates from Syria. What sustained the legions was puls, a barley or spelt gruel thickened with water flavored only by salt, and when fortune allowed, onions or lard. Cooked slowly over flickering coals, puls was the dependable starch of empire far removed from the banquets of senators. It did not please the palate, it kept men alive. Rest days might see loaves of coarse panis rusticus baked in communal ovens, but even then the discipline of the army defined even this minor comfort. Bread distributed by centurions, weighed, measured, issued in silence at dusk. Wine, the favored symbol of Roman conviviality, underwent a transformation on campaign. The soldiers drank posca, a blend of sour wine vinegar diluted with water, sharp, acrid, and antiseptic. It cut heat and killed bacteria, but offered none of Bacchus' delight. The vinegar tanged on the tongue, and though legionaries learned to tolerate or even prefer it after months in harsh terrain, it could sap morale when barrels cracked or shipments dried. Falernian and Caecuban vintages were mythic to the ranks, echoes from another world, unbottled only in songs or campfire boasts. The daily ration was a half-liter portioned by rank and duty, sometimes traded informally when boredom set in. In good order, supply ships from Puteoli or Ostia brought bulk amphorae packed under olive oil seals, but during river crossings or long marches into Marcian hills or Alpine passes, spoilage often struck unannounced. Leaking jars, moldy corks, swelling yeast. Each could ferment not just vinegar but discontent. The importance of drink to the soldier's spirit was not lost on the high command. Augustus ensured that frontier garrisons in Germania and Illyricum received scheduled rations of posca cervigia and salt to flavor what few meats they cooked. But these rhythms broke easily. A single lost convoy on the Danube, one delayed caravan through the Roman East, could remove the sour comfort from thousands of mouths. On campaign, soldiers learned to stretch rations with foraged herbs, lentils from crushed stock, or field-roasted acorns. Yet deprivation bred tension faster than defeat. In Tacitus and Velleius, veterans marched grimly, their tongues thick with the dryness of missed rations, and dry vinegar their vision, shaped less by strategy than by water skins and missing wine amphorae.